Now, I was in New York City all week long for a conference, and there is nothing simple about New York City. I mean, when I get off the plane and we walk outside to get our ride, everybody is yelling at each other and screaming. There's horns going off. And come to find out, that's just how it is in New York City. And I was asking one of our staff members, Will, who grew up in New York, I said, why does everybody yell at each other? Well, they have to talk over the traffic, right? And I mean, it's just a place that's constantly busy. The subway system, crazy. Not only does it smell like urine, but during rush hour, I mean, people are just packed in like sardines, right? And what's very uncomfortable is when a lady comes to stand next to you and she grabs the guardrail or the handrail and her armpit is right in your face. And you're thinking, do they take showers in New York City? Luckily, it wasn't all hairy, because those Hungarian ones I've been on, oh man, it's terrible, terrible. Even worship, we were in worship a lot of times this week in New York City, and people just pack in, and you know, being a guy from Texas that loves his car and loves space, I mean, I'm just sitting there trying to worship, you know, like this, and I just feel, I mean, busy, hurried, crazy. We went to Times Square one evening. We went there during hours when it was light, and it's so bright there, we had no idea when darkness actually came. You look down at your watch and you're going, oh man, it's 10 p.m. at night. That was way past our bedtime. It's just a crazy place. But that busyness that we see in New York has been exported here. I mean, we see that today. I mean, you and I are busy. We are hurried. We live in a culture that finds busyness to be kind of a badge of honor. We live in a time where our ego senses that busyness is a good and healthy thing. Interesting, in 1967, there were some futurists that were predicting that the biggest problem coming to American society is that we would have too much spare time on our hands. They actually went to a Senate subcommittee and presented their findings. They said by the year 1985, the average work week will be 22 hours. They kind of missed that one a little bit, right? In fact, America leads the industrialized world in average hours worked every week. The National Sleep Foundation says that the average American works 50 plus hours. That's extraordinary. But what's even more extraordinary is that we work 50 plus hours and we juggle families and relationships, church, and then all of the other opportunities that we put around that. And it just gets harried for us. And it's easy for us to become overwhelmed. It's easy for us to lose sleep because we're anxious all the time, or worry about the future because we're not sure what it holds, or perhaps we're so afraid of getting stuck that we just overschedule ourselves because we don't know what to do with downtime. We pass each other in the hallways and we know each other's names and have lots of acquaintances, but we don't really have deep, healthy, intimate relationships with people. We also live in a time where the opportunities are mind-boggling. I mean, the opportunities that we have today are unlike anything we've ever experienced in history. I mean, opportunities for children, for seniors, for travel, for education, for church, for volunteerism. And you put just the busyness and hurriedness and all those opportunities that are laid right in front of us, and it's easy to see how complex and crazy our lives become really quickly. Really quickly. And the funny thing is we try to justify this, right? We try to manage this complexity, this busyness, and so we'll say things like, you know, when I'm done with school, you know, everything will slow down. Or when I get a new job, or if I just had a new boss, when I get a new boss, or when I become the boss, right, things will slow down. Or when the kids move out, right? Or if I just made more money. If I made more money, I'd have more time. Well, all the while we are just living in this crazy, busy, complex life, we are minimalizing margin in our life. And the Bible talks about this sacred space where we spend time with Jesus. This sacred space between our work and the other aspects of life where we just have to stop and cease and just allow Him to invest in love in us, to receive that love so that we can then turn around and express it, to slow down our life so that we're not making decisions on the fly and snap judgments here and there. I love what Richard Swenson, he is the author of the book Margin, and his definition for margin is this: it's the space between our load, it's that space between our load and our limits. The space between our load and our limits. And oftentimes the problem is that we fill up, we overload ourselves to the point that it exceeds our limit. Let me just give you an illustration. Last summer I was in China, and it's too late now. So I was in that part of the world, and I was backpacking with one of our workers there, and it was one of the most incredible couple days that I've ever had in my life. We were backpacking into these villages that you can't see from the map because of the foliage, but we're backpacking into these villages that have never heard the gospel. I mean, in some cases, they've not even seen a believer before. I mean, they're literally there worshiping trees and rocks. I'm not understating or overstating that at all. And we would walk into these villages, and we would develop relationships, and so that we could come back over and over and over. And so we were getting ready to go. In fact, I have some pictures of kind of where we were headed. You can pull that up. So, I mean, it's beautiful. Pictures aren't great. I mean, just with iPhone here. Those are the rice terraces, and we were covering all that ground. And there's one other picture of, and you can't see how huge my backpack is, but just trust me, it was huge. And but we were taking supplies into these villages, and somehow I got elected as the pack mule, probably because I was the biggest guy there. But some decisions had to be made before we left because we were going to be traveling 15 to 20 miles on foot up and down those mountains that day. And so I had to pack, and by the way, I don't do that on a regular basis. So we had to figure out, and I had to figure out, what I could take, what my load would be so that it wouldn't exceed my limits. And I had to build some margin in there because you just never know when you're in that part of the world what might happen. Well, sure enough, we're walking, and then we're going, well, where are we? And we keep walking. And we're looking at the compass, and we're looking at the GPS, and we're asking our translators, do you know where we are? We're not real sure where we are. And in Chinese, the word crisis in Chinese means dangerous opportunity. So we were in crisis. We ended up walking 30 miles on foot that day. We couldn't find our hotel, so we stayed at a army base there, and which is cool. I mean, who stays in an Asian army base? When you get lost. It was a great shower. In fact, I would say it's probably one of the best showers I have ever had in my life. But thankfully, I made sure that my load did not exceed my limit. Because had that been the case, I would have just run out of fuel. I would have had to stop, couldn't go anywhere else, and that would have been bad news based on where we were located. But for most of us, that's the same issue, is that we don't consider the space between our load and our limits. And we overload ourselves to such a point that when it hits our limits, then we get frustrated and angry and concerned and worried, and we don't know what to do. Well, good news is this, is that the Bible talks a lot about that space. It talks a lot about what we do with that load and our limits. So if you have your Bibles, I want you to turn to Luke chapter 10, verse 38 through 42. Great passage. Many of us have studied this. If you've ever been in children's Sunday school, you always study about this. It's a great passage. It's the Martha and Mary passage. And let me just read this. Luke 10, verse 38 through 42, and it says this: Now they went on their way. Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and you are troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Now, a couple things here. One, there's something inside of me that wants to go on protest for Martha, just for a second, right? I mean, we want to look at Jesus and be like, Jesus, seriously though, like the woman needs some help. You know, we need help. I mean, I think for a lot of us, we probably have that sense at points that we want to take up for Martha that, listen, we are working hard, Lord. And can you help somebody out here? And by the way, just a quick note. Jesus is not saying that we shouldn't serve. He's also not saying that hard work is a bad thing. He doesn't say anything negative about hard work. What he says is that she is missing out, that she is being pulled in a direction and she's missing something that's primary. She's missing the good portion. And oh, what a lesson for us, because so often we get pulled away, we get distracted and troubled, just like Martha was, and we miss out on the good portion. I mean, a couple problems here. One, we see Mary, at least from Martha's standpoint, Mary appears to be lazy, right? That she's not working as hard. And what I would bet, I mean, if Martha is anything like us, and I think she probably is, she got her worth from her work. Jesus, look at me. I am working so hard. I mean, hours. I mean, here you are in my house, and I'm just working. Right? And we derive our worth from our work, or at least a portion of it. Sometimes we'll come back to that. You're like, oh, great. The second problem is this, is that Martha's work is producing anxiety and trouble. Anxiety and trouble. That Greek word there for anxiety is also the word for apprehension, worry, uneasiness. That Greek word for trouble is the word trouble. But if you have ever experienced apprehension, uneasiness, anxiety because of work, hey, good news, bad news is you identify with Martha. But her work was creating frustration. She wasn't engaging who or what was the better portion. She was given spiritual leftovers to Jesus. But here's the good news, is that Jesus is saying that if you choose the good portion, there's something different that's going to take place. And what I give you cannot be taken away from you. But let me go back for a second. One of the problems in our society, one of the problems, I think, even with our ego, if I may talk about that collectively for a second, is that we often are conditioned to find our worth in work. We're conditioned that way. I mean, think about it. I mean, we're categorized constantly. We're evaluated constantly. The American dream, the idea of that is being perpetuated and pushed onto us. I mean, from very early on in school, we have A students, B students, and C students. I'm not sure what an A student feels like, but we're categorized that way, right? Every time we fill out a document, they're asking questions because they're categorizing us. If you've ever had a performance review, those are fun. right? It's evaluation. And we come out of there sometimes going, man, either we're coming out going, man, I'm a beast, I'm awesome at whatever I'm doing, right? And so we derive our worth based on a good report, or we go, man, I'm just nothing. I don't know how I'm going to do this job again. And maybe we got one or two criticisms, right? Again, we base our worth on those things. You know, the American dream is constantly saying if you just work as hard as you can do anything, right? Isn't that what they told the immigrants that were coming over? Isn't that what we still preach today in our culture, in our society? Isn't that why immigration continues to happen into America? Because if you just work your hardest, then you can be whatever you want to be. Well, it's so easy for us to find our worth in our work. I remember about 9 years ago, I'd been at the church for about 2.5 years at that point. 9 years ago, I had just started my doctoral work, and one of the cohorts or one of the seminars that I was doing was requiring me to log my hours. And so I was like, okay, I can do that. So for the next 4 weeks, I'm logging my hours. Well, come to find out, I was working just under 100 hours. I thought that was awesome. I was like, man, I'm doing so much for the Lord. He must be so pleased with me. Shortly after that, I remember talking to Laura, and I said, hey, I think it's time for us to have kids. You know what she said? Godly, wise woman that she is. She said, no. She said, ain't no way the schedule that you're keeping that you can be a father. She said it a whole lot nicer than that. And what did I do? I got upset. What are you talking about? I mean, look how successful we're being right now. Look at what your husband is doing. I mean, God is pleased with us. This is the perfect time to have kids. And of course, then it spills over. I'm meeting with one of my prayer mentors, a week or two later, and we're sitting in there, and I'm like, my wife won't let us have kids. She better not, we better keep being able to practice. And, and I'm just complaining to her about this, him about this. My prayer mentor is not a woman, it's a man. And complaining to him about this, and he looks at me and he says, your life is insidious. It's like, I'd never even heard that word except for on Star Wars. He says, your life is so insidious. You are lucky that you are even still married to that beautiful woman. You are lucky you haven't done something stupid in your ministry that sabotages it all. And I'm like, well, I hadn't really thought about it like that. And you know what? He was so right. My wife was so right. That my load had exceeded my limit, and I was doing nothing very well. I was doing a lot of stuff. I mean, there was activity to point to. But there wasn't godliness and holiness and fruitfulness. And the truth of the matter is that is how we live our life typically, unless if we schedule that space. Unless we choose to make those critical changes. So we often don't want to stop. We want to keep hurrying because we find our worth in our work. That other problem that we see there is that we're afraid to slow down because we think we're going to miss something, right? We don't want to miss out on those opportunities. We're afraid to slow down. And I'm sorry to say this, but the root problem is just pride. It's just straight up pride. Actually, I'm not sorry to say it at all. It just is. It is what it is. And the way it manifests itself, it can be really ugly. It'll manifest itself in people-pleasing. That we have a fear of others' disapproval, or we want to make sure that we meet other people's expectations. It manifests itself in power, that we think that if we just stay in control, then we'll get this licked. So staying busy means staying in control, right? Or possessions, we work to earn, we earn to spend, right? The more we have, the better we feel about ourselves. We can point to the Joneses and say, look, we got more. Position. We justify this all the time. The position I hold requires me this. I do what I do because that's just what the position requires, right? I'm an accountant, so this is just how it is. I'm an officer of a corporation. I'm a teacher. I'm a mom. It just is what it is. Prestige. If I keep pushing myself, I'll finally arrive or meet my dreams. Perfectionism. I don't want to slow down because I might make a mistake. Or just to prove something that oftentimes we continue to work just to validate ourselves before our friends, family, or coworkers. But the thing is when we don't slow down, we, just like Martha, we give Jesus our spiritual leftovers. But here's the grace in all this. Here's the great news for us this morning. Here's the great news that was for Martha in that moment where she is frustrated and Jesus looks at her and says, Martha, Martha, Mary has chosen the good portion. And here's what the good news is that Jesus is ready to receive you wherever you are in the complexity and busyness of life. That's great news. That at any point you can just say, I am going to stop. I want to be with you. And you may be thinking, you don't know my situation. Hang with me. But you may be exhausted. You may be tired. You may be saying, I don't know how to do this as a single mom. I don't know how to do this as a single dad. I don't know how to do this with, with 4, 5, 6, 12 kids. And, we'll put them to work. But you can stop whenever, and Jesus will receive you. He was ready to receive Martha and say, honey, come sit next to your sister and sit with me. The other thing is this, is that Jesus restores you from wherever you've been in the complexity and busyness of life. He restores you. Man, that's great news, because I know that within the complexity and busyness of life, sometimes we just get hurt. There's pain. We get stepped on, or we step on others. And Jesus' promise, the good news there is that He restores you and me in those moments. I love King David knew this real well. In fact, he talked about it a lot in the Psalms. Just a couple of them that I want to share with you, because he really expressed what it meant to be in the presence of God, allowing Him to be our portion. A couple of my favorites. Psalm 16:5, it says, "The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot." That idea for lot. You hold my everything. You are my chosen portion. He says, Psalm 73:26, he says, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." Man, isn't that beautiful? I would imagine some of us just need to hear it. We just need to sit with that for a bit. I love Psalm 142:5. This is probably more where I was 9 years ago. "I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living." Man, I love it. Essentially what David is saying is that you are my provider, you are my protector, you are my healer, you are my peace, you are my shepherd, you are my almighty. And what David and Mary knew was that making Jesus their portion would direct their agenda. When we make Jesus our primary portion, He directs our agenda. I know for some of us, we'll come out of a message like this, and we'll go, I just need to stop some things. I just need to quit doing some stuff. And so we'll go check our to-do list, right, on our iPad or iPhone, and we'll go, okay, well, I'm going to stop doing this. I'm going to stop doing that. We'll contact our secretary and go, you need to take this off. And we'll just start going through the list. And that's not what we're talking about here this morning. What we're talking about here is allowing Jesus to be the primary and good portion in our life, and then allowing Him to direct our agenda. You want simplicity in your life? Yes, there are some disciplines that you need to practice. We're going to talk about those in a second. But the primary piece is to make Jesus your portion. Why? Because He will receive you right where you're at, and He will restore you everything that you need. So what does it look like to partake in the good portion? I mean, what does that look like? Some application for us this morning. First thing is this, is rest regularly. Rest regularly. I grew up, my great-grandfather, in fact, not this coming week, but the next week, my father and I are going to Sweden together. It's going to be so cool, and we're retracing our family history. Pretty awesome. I get to do that with my dad. And he's a historian. He's done all the homework, and so hopefully we're not like those two, that father-son that end up, I think, in Oslo, Norway, that MasterCard commercial, and they're like, oh, we're from Stockholm. We're actually starting in Stockholm. But I grew up in a family where my great-grandfather was an immigrant, Peter. And Peter came from the southwest part of Sweden and came to the Midwest. And he worked his tail off to provide for his family. He met a woman here and married. They had my grandfather. My grandfather was a Great Depression baby. Actually, he was born before that, but when he was 30, he was right in the middle of a Great Depression. And so, he worked not so much because he was choosing to negate Sabbath time and rest, but he worked to survive. And he passed that on to my father, who has an incredible work ethic. But, I come from a family that has worked. And the reality is that's probably very similar to you. Is that in our lineage, in our genealogy, we have been conditioned not to rest. And when we do, we feel guilty about it and shameful about it. What else could we be doing? I mean, my grandfather moved, he moved all the way from Sweden so that I could have this great life in America, so I have got to work. And so the idea of rest, oftentimes we just throw that out. Now, we'll take a vacation, right? But to rest on a regular basis, on a week-to-week basis, even points during the day, that's outside of how our culture teaches us and even what our ego informs of us. But you need to understand this is a demonic deal here. That busyness comes from Satan. In fact, one of his most subtle but most effective ploys is to get you and I to be exhausted. Because he knows that if we're tired physically, spiritually, emotionally, then we're irritable. I mean, you know this with kids, right? We're easily triggered. We make snap decisions. We take shortcuts. And we compromise integrity when we're tired. When we're exhausted. We have this idea that, this illusion really that we're in control. And so, we'll justify it by saying, I just have to be at that meeting. I have to make sure that my kid gets to that place. Because the world is in our hands. I love what the Apostle Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. He says this, "For by Him," and that's Jesus, "by Him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Man, that's great news for us. And truth is, we have to move from this thinking that I hold the whole world in my hands to the fact that he holds the whole world in my hands. Is life going to collapse if we don't make that meeting or return that phone call? Or go on that business trip, or get our kids to that sacred soccer game, or whatever that is? No. Why? Because God holds all things together. That's good stuff, man. Man, you should be more excited about this. You know, the other thing about this is that Jesus wants us to rest in such a way that it's pleasurable and delightful for us. You know, he doesn't want us just to, I don't have a problem sitting in front watching a ball game or something on TV, but he doesn't want us to just sit in front of the TV for 8 hours. That's not rest. But he wants us to engage in things that are pleasurable and delightful. I mean, think about it for a second here. I mean, when Jesus came to earth, there had been just hundreds and hundreds of years of the Jews practicing the Sabbath, right? So it's 6 days on, one 24-hour period of rest. 6 days on, one 24-hour period of rest. And up to that point, the Jews had just created so many fences and containers around that Sabbath day that you couldn't do anything. I mean, you couldn't even walk and turn on a light. Well, they didn't have light switches back then. You couldn't light a candle. I mean, there were just so many things you just could not do. And you may remember when Jesus was out one day, it was on the Sabbath, and he heals a man, right? And the Pharisees are like, oh my goodness, he just healed a man? You have broken the Sabbath. I would imagine that Jesus took joy and pleasure in healing. Those times of rest should be delightful and joyful. And how often do we play the Pharisee in our own life, right? To say that we don't need rest, we don't deserve rest. I mean, you fill in the blank. And the reality is that God created a rhythm for rest, that we need that in our life to function well. You want simplicity in your life? Rest regularly. I heard a rabbi say, I think this is incredible wisdom. He said that if you work with your mind, you should rest with your hands. If you work with your hands, you should rest with your mind. So for me, I mainly work with my mind, right? So rest for me is usually exercise. Maybe it's sort of working around the house a little bit. I think Laura wish I could do more than I really can, but she's very gracious about that. You know, yesterday was just a great time. She and I just were able, and Emma Grace, we did a walk with Emma Grace and the dog, and then she was spending some time with some other kids, and then we just went and walked 2.5, 3 miles together. We ate a lot of Mexican food, then we walked. And then we had snow cones. So we completely botched the walking. But it was awesome. And we just got to talk and just spend time together. And it was Sabbath. It was restful. I got back to the house and I was just like energized, right? So rest ought to be pleasurable. I don't know what that looks like. I think that looks different for every person. Your rest may be my work. I mean, if you want me to balance a checkbook, I ain't doing it, as a restful activity, right? My wife, on the other hand, she's awesome at it. She loves it. She's like, man, this is great. So it looks different for everybody, but we need to rest regularly. Okay, second thing is we must resist work. You must resist work. Now, what I'm not suggesting, and as Jesus was not suggesting in the passage, is that work is bad. In fact, work is great. I mean, you can go to the Proverbs, you can see it all over the place. We should be faithful to working. But again, the way that our ego relates to our work and our worth, and the way our culture demands that of us, there are moments where we need to resist work. And if you've been reading the 24 book, we talked this week about Sabbath. And the word Sabbath literally means to stop, to cease. Again, it goes back to that rhythm of rest that and the first part of Genesis, God talks about. He says, listen, you're going to work 6 days. He values work a whole lot, right? And you need to rest one day. That there's that rhythm that needs to take place, that it's consistent, that it's regular, that it's constant. That you're resting, but in that rest, you're also not working. And what that means is that you're not doing paid work or unpaid work, that you have some time where you are just resting. You know, one of the things that we talked about in the book that I'll just mention here is that we need to schedule for who we want to become, not what we want to accomplish. We schedule our lives in such a way around who we want to become, not what we want to accomplish. And oftentimes, I think we do more activity than our relationship with God can sustain. And that activity turns into mastery over us, right? Our schedule will master us, our activities, some of the things that we do. And keep in mind, if there's anything that has mastery over you and me, it's idolatry. And the truth of the matter is, if you are choosing not to rest and resist work, then you are practicing idolatry. That you are more in control than God is. That you are God's gift of you fill in the blank. And when we rest and when we resist work, it's an affirmation of trust. This also just comes to mind too. That passage in Psalm 46:10 where it says, be still and know that I'm God. Typically that's where we stop. And we'll go, oh man, just Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I'm God. Do you know what the rest of that passage says? So that I being God, so that I may be exalted in all the nations. Do you understand that when we rest, that when we're still, it's an affirmation of the sovereignty of God? That He is in control and we are not. And people take notice of that. That's why it glorifies God among the nations, that people take notice of that rest and Sabbath. You know, just another quick note, and then we'll move on to the third point. When we are hurried, it's just hard to love. It's hard to love well. You know, when we are just in a hurry, it's hard for us to love well. And that's one of the primary things that God has created us to do, is to love Him well, one. And for that to spill over in loving others well. So that rest, regular rest, that resistance to work while you're resting honors the Lord. It honors the Lord. Last thing is this. And listen, this is the culmination of this. I mean, this has to happen, or those other two disciplines of resting regularly and resisting work just aren't going to happen, okay? And the third thing is this, is that we have to reflect on the King. That we reflect on the King. Man, I talk to people all the time that are very successful in their jobs and what they do, and they get to the place in life and they look back and they go, you know, I don't understand why I don't have good, healthy, deep, intimate relationships. I don't understand why my child doesn't want to spend time with me on a regular basis now. And the reason is that they never developed a relationship with them. For years, they were just on the go, work. And they never developed an intimate relationship with those that God had put around them. Man, that's a tragic place to be. Now, again, God can restore those relationships. Man, there's so much good news in that still. But our relationship with the Lord is the same. That for many believers, they come to that place where they recognize their justification in Christ because of what He did for us on the cross. And they say, man, I want Jesus in my life. I want Him to be Lord and Master and Shepherd of my life. And we make that decision to follow Him. We recognize that it is by His righteousness that we are saved and that He cleans us. And we rejoice in that, and we come to church on Sunday and all those things, and we feel good about that. But the rest of our time with the Lord is really non-existent. That we are thankful that we're a child of God, but the truth is we don't even know our Father. And unless if we are consistently reflecting on what He did and on who He is, we can't have that type of relationship with Him that He is encouraging Mary to have, that good portion relationship. Simplicity is not going to develop just from disciplines alone. If you walk away from here and you say, I'm going to schedule some rest, and you should. And you walk away from here and you say, I'm going to try to resist work, and you should. But if you don't integrate this and recognize that the relationship with Jesus is critical and key in order to direct your agenda on a day-to-day basis, then you've missed the point. That's what Jesus was saying to Mary and Martha. Martha, Martha, Mary has chosen the good portion. He wasn't saying don't ever work. He was saying, don't miss out on the relationship that I long to have with you. And this busyness has become a distraction for us. It's created trouble. And we need Jesus to speak supernaturally into our lives. And that will not happen unless if we consistently find time to cease, to stop, and reflect on Him. So here's what I would encourage you to do as it relates to that. I want two things. Everybody have your phone? I actually don't have my phone on me. You have your phone? Hold your phone up. Just pretend like we're at a concert and just kind of wave it in the air like you just don't care, right? Right? You don't have to turn it on. That's pretty good. That's all right. If you have a digital phone, this may be hard to do. Or analog, I mean. So it's unbelievable to think that even when I was in college, we didn't have cell phones, right? That's how new they are. But they run our life, don't they? So here's what I want you to do. If some of you may spend time with the Lord every day, man, praise God. That's a great thing. Some may really be struggling with that. That's probably the majority of that. Okay. So let's start something new today, right? So here's what I'm going to ask you is that you give God your first 5 and your mid 5. So your first 5 is this, is that when you get up, before you brush your teeth even, because He really doesn't care if you have good breath or bad breath, before you check your email, before you turn on CNN or Fox News, whatever you choose to watch, that you would spend 5 minutes reflecting on the King. And here's what that might look like. I would suggest that you spend the first 60 seconds just in complete silence. Now, some of you are going to be going, you're going to get to like second 15, and you're going to be going, has it been 3 minutes already? Because silence is so obtuse to our worldview. I mean, we just, it's hard for us. But you spend the first 60 seconds just in silence. You spend the next couple minutes spending time just reading the Bible. And here's where I would start. If you don't know where to start, I would just start in the book of Luke. Read what happens before the Mary and Martha account, right? Luke chapter 1. Just read for about 2 minutes. And then after that, just have a conversation with God about what you just read. If you're just saying, where do I start? Just somewhere. Now, some of you are going, man, I spend like 3 hours. Great, I don't. I think that is great. I mean, God does create people to do that, and praise God. I bet your 5 minutes will increase over time. I hope it does. I think it will. But if you don't have any time with the Lord, first 5. And then the reason I had you get your phone out is this. I want you to schedule a mid-5. Sometime during the day before you get home, or before you pick up your kids, or maybe as you're home, that sometime after lunch and before dinner, you take a mid-5 and you do the same thing. Because I don't know if you're like me, and or if you're like typical society. I mean, you get up, you get the kids ready to go. Maybe you don't get the kids ready to go, but you get to work, and then you're in traffic for 15, 20, 30, 40 minutes. And by the time you're out of traffic, I mean, you woke up, you had time with the Lord, you're feeling like super Christian, you feel great. But by the time traffic is over, you're like half of super Christian, right? They've taken the cape, your boots, everything off, okay? And then you have some type of conversation at work, and they're like, well, no, you didn't do a good job. And so now you're like seething, and there's like, they've taken your belt away now. And that big S for super Christian that you've been wearing on your shirt, by the end of the day, you get some other reports on your desk, or you have a bad conversation with a kid that you've been teaching, or maybe your kid comes home and is just trying to negotiate or to complain about something. You're like, no, you didn't. And then by that time, the S is gone too. And what we need is some time in the middle of the day where we stop and we rest in Him. And you may be saying, man, I work all day long. Go to the bathroom for 5 minutes. Say, I got to go to the bathroom. Just pull it out of your back pocket. You don't even have to go to the bathroom. Just sit on the commode and just have 5 minutes with Jesus. That would be an awesome Facebook quote. But find time during the day, your first 5 and your mid-5, where you can spend time with the King, that you can reflect on Him for who He is, what He has done for you and me. I have a good idea of where most of us are at today because I put on pants just like you. Kids, family, relationships, job, all those things. And I know that we just need time to rest. I even know that worship can be, hurry up. I mean, we got timesheets up here, and I get so much time and usually take more than I'm supposed to, and everything is just. I know that days can be rushed. I know church is rushed. I mean, just getting out of the house on a Sunday can be hard. And so I just want to take maybe 2 minutes, maybe 1 minute based on the time. And I just want us to think about 3 things. I heard somebody say the other day, and I just thought it was pretty interesting. 3 phrases that sum up the Scriptures. And we're just going to have those on the screen. And those 3 phrases are this: I am with you, I love you, and do not be afraid. I mean, that probably does cover most of Scripture, right? I mean, that's great. I am with you, I love you, and do not be afraid. And here's what I want us to do. Just in the time, the silent time, band's not going to come up. Nobody's, don't whisper to your neighbor. What do you need to hear this morning from Jesus? What do you need to hear from Him? Do you need Him just to speak into your heart and say, in your mind, and say, I am with you? Maybe you just feel super lonely. Project at work and you're getting some criticism, and it's probably undeserved, and you just need to know, you need to hear Jesus say, I'm with you. Because in those times of silence and solitude, this is when he speaks. Or maybe you need to hear him say, I love you. I mean, you're thinking back to your past, thinking back to relationships with maybe mom and dad or an ex-spouse or whatever, and you've just been beaten down, and you just need to hear Jesus say to you, I love you. I love you. Maybe that you need to hear him say, do not be afraid. Go boldly before the people on my behalf. Do not be